Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where we talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Watchmen. Another great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, now we kind of get, the telling of how the whole John and Angela thing happened, or rather Cal and Angela, and that just being a whole thing in itself. It's so interesting, and I like how this episode, the way the episode is almost disjointed, but in a carefully planned manner, because basically it's supposed to kind of represent the fact is of how Dr. Manhattan sees time. So the way all these events are almost like told out of sequence, and I love that it's almost like in a beautiful way. It's a very interesting take on a love story, because it's like rather than a love story being told backwards or forward, it's being told in a very matched order, both being forward and backwards, literally all at the same time. So it's just a very unique story. Obviously, him showing up on Earth, pretending to be some dude painted blue, wearing a Dr. Manhattan mask. It's like, well, if you're Dr. Manhattan, don't you glow? It's like, oh yeah, but I don't want anyone to know who I am, and I'm here to ask you out for dinner. And it's like, because the whole time you're like, okay, so why is he taking so much time to, why Angela in particular? Is because he saw this is where his future would take him, and and I love that being a complex thing, and that being a thing that, there's always that thing about, like, it's the comparison I can think of. It's like the whole Superman thing, or like what makes Superman interesting. Like the fact is, a lot of people take Superman as being a boring character because he's this godlike character. So how can you really, bring any stories to that? But to me, it's always the human element that, that's, and I think that's an element that Supergirl nails. It brings, that's an element that Smallville brought to you as well. Just this human element of this being with immense powers, doing good, having their own code and being their own person while struggling to have an everyday life of balancing it all. And it's just, the parallel exists in that regard, in this, for this sake, in that, you're a god you're basically a god, and everything's going to play out the way it does, which obviously that affects your relationships. That's why your other relationships didn't work out, because you are so split, because like you're caught between not caring, and then also at the same time, you try to care, but it seems like it's lost on you now that you become this being. But now seeing everything's supposed to go this certain way, you're kind of like, okay. So he's basically fallen. For him, it's just kind of a thing of like, things are going to play it a certain way. There's no changing it. So he kind of goes with the flow with it, but he kind of enjoys the ride along the way. And we learned that, like, he was never on Mars. He was actually on one of Jupiter's moons, Europa. He just made like basically a fake version of himself to kind of like continue, doing things for the past 30 years to make it seem like he's been on Mars doing something. And I love that. But it's like he went on Jupiter, and he made, Europa, and he made the world that we see, that quote unquote paradise that Adrian is trapped in. And then it's like, oh man, it's like, so obviously going back to the fact is everything for the past couple episodes has been more and more clear that a person who made all that had to be Dr. Manhattan. He's literally the one-of-a-kind being in this universe, and to know he made that entire world, even him walking on water, where Angela's like, well, can you walk on water? He's like, yeah, and she's like, oh, okay. I love that, like, because obviously she thinks his entire thing is like some ploy or trick. It's just kind of like, you're some delusional dude, like, whatever, dude, you're dressed up like you Dr. Manhattan. What I love too is she brought up a point that I thought was so interesting, I didn't even think about it. She's like, yeah, I didn't even think about it. It's like, you've been with Dr. Manhattan for the past 10 years, and it's like, but like, what the point when she brought up the point she would never date Dr. Manhattan because she actually hates him, because the US brought him into Vietnam. He killed a lot of people. That led to that person who was the bomber to grow up and basically kill her parents. So it's like Dr. Manhattan is basically responsible for her parents dying indirectly, while also being super directly, So it has this element of like, it's interesting. You hate this person who basically kind of ruined your life, and to think that you spent the next 10 years with them, it's kind of interesting in the grand scheme of things. Like, that's, no love, no relationship is perfect. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Also learning a story about like what, because it should have correlated in my head. Mr. Phillips and Mrs. Crowshank obviously would look the way they do for a specific reason. It turns out the first people John had ever seen, in love or have sex were the people that Mr. Philip and Mrs. Crookshank are based on. And it's like, oh, they wanted to have a child of their own again because they lost their previous one, and they gave him the Bible and taught him about Adam and Eve. And when he created his world, because they said, like, tell us, when you're in America, like, you grow up, you'll create something beautiful. And now with Dr. Manhattan, all those decades later, he did that. He making these two his Adam and Eve, and I'm like, it's so interesting how that all kind of trails back. I mean, they were your inspiration, so, which even like, Angelo was like, oh wow, you have quite the imagination, and he laughs, and she's like, was joking on something? He's like, no, literally 6 months from now, an old friend, or a colleague of mine, talks about the fact is I don't have an imagination. I love how the story is structured, because they make references back and forth between the different time frames, and it's so confused, because I even love him being like, yeah, I see time in a way that would frustrate you. In the grand scheme of things, you can understand like that. Once again, that's the beauty of this whole situation. The fact is you're able to see time like that. Like for you, it's literally all happening at once. So it's kind of a little hard to distinguish between what's 6 months from now, what's 2 weeks from now, what's 10 years from now. It all kind of literally not all kind of, it directly all blurs together. So I thought that was fascinating. Even of course, like the whole conversation about like why Cal looks the way he does is like, well, of course that should have been clear too, of like, oh, that must have come from something. So, and it's that whole thing of knowing stuff ahead of time, but it's like, oh no, like she's like, well, the fact of the matter is you're blue and everything. How are we going to get around that if you don't want to be noticed? He's like, you come up with a solution with that. And so it's that whole thing of like, okay, she shows him, all these different bodies, but he's almost like, I don't really care what I look like. And she's like, well, I don't care what you look like either. And he's like, sorry, so pick one. But then it's like, he's kind of had a feeling she was still holding back because he already knew the truth. So she reveals Cal's body, because I guess she didn't want to be like, I want you to look like this. Maybe she probably felt weird of like, she had an idea of what she wanted John to look like now, but she didn't want to really say it. Maybe she felt too embarrassed, but John already knew ahead of time, because even present day, somewhat present day, when they're meeting for the first time in the bar and everything, she's like, which I even love the title of the episode being a bit of a pun, it being like a god walks into Abar, which obviously that's her name, but also, a bar, so it's just interesting. It took me a second to get that until I saw her name, and I was like, all right, nice pun. But regardless of all of that, the fact is, he's like, yeah, you come up with an idea. She's like, what is that idea? He's like, I'm not going to tell you. And I love that thing, because it's that whole thing of like, it almost seems like, even because the whole thing with John is, even if he tells you what's going to happen, everything's going to happen, because the events of us having this whole conversation about what's going to happen is eventually going to turn into what happens. I think that's fascinating. Like, for example, there's the whole situation of like 6 months from now, we're in the middle love making, but eventually it's going to lead to an argument. And she's like, well, no, we just won't have the argument. But then the argument ends up happening anyway, because the whole conversation about, what was it exactly he said that kind of pissed her off? I think it was the whole thing of like her wanting more, because basically their relationship fills a hole in her, because she wants to kind of love because, or have a family, because that was never something that, it was kind of missing from her own life. It was something of that sort that Kala said, and that kind of pissed her off, and it was like, yep, now I want you to leave and everything. So, and then we do tie that into the whole Adrian story, which Cal shows up at Adrian's facility. And I love Adrian's watching all this, because he's like, he's almost looking at the world like a bunch of idiots, because it's like, I literally laid the foundation for you guys to kind of move past all of this stuff. It's like, for one, I made the whole squid thing happen. But also, it's just like, the fact is, I'm giving them the necessary tools to not do what they're doing, but they're building weapons and stuff like that. And it's like, why would they do that? But Cal says, ironically, it's because these weapons are meant to make them feel safe. So it's like, oh, he recognizes John immediately, because John's the only one that would show up at his place like that. Then we find out about, like, obviously we see him, doing the squid thing. Because obviously the whole squid thing, making it rain and stuff like that, is meant to perpetuate the lie. Because, at the very least, because he doesn't want people, because the whole point is to keep the peace going. And if he makes it rain little squid every once in a while, that's enough to perpetuate in people's minds of like, well, because, the thought of like, oh, the squid could, another squid, psychic squid could show up, another New York situation can happen. That sure, but having the squids there make it even more cemented in people's minds of like, yeah, I mean, because hell, even look at Wade, aka Looking Glass. He was always waiting for the next big one. So even if you don't do that for everyone, at least enough people are paranoid about it, but everyone else kind of goes about their day. So it almost defeats the purpose in a sense, because it seems like most people just kind of go, whatever, because like that whole conversation came up about like, yeah, it ain't interesting like how it is raining squid and stuff like that, but we just pull over, turn on our wipers and act like it's nothing. It's just like, oh, another day in the neighborhood type of situation. So I thought that was kind of an interesting conversation in the long run, but I love it. It's also like, when in the moment you're talking to me right now, present day, what's happening right now back in 85 with you, John? It's like, oh yeah, you just tried to destroy me. And Adrian's like, yeah, sorry about that. It's like, yeah, I love how it's been like 20 some years, and we kind of quickly go, it's like, well, the fact of the matter is it has been 20 years, but because John is the one that is the very like non-emotional person, like just because of what he is now, that little bit of that humanity kind of slipping away from him. He doesn't care too much. It's like, I guess he just kind of lets bygones be bygones and just kind of accepting it as it is. It's also interesting to think, I mean, it's kind of interesting going through all this. And I think that kind of speaks volumes about Angela, that Angela's the one that basically helped John get back his humanity, something he lost ever since he became Dr. Manhattan. I skipped over it, but that was a really good conversation about like, well, what do you have to fear, John? You're literally a god. Like, you don't have to be vulnerable. You don't have to be afraid. But he's like, I'm always afraid because when's the last time you were afraid? Because that's a very human thing to do, to be afraid, to kind of like take risk in life. But nothing in life is a risk to you because you've literally seen it all. And for him, it was like, the last time I was afraid was 59, when he basically became Dr. Manhattan. She's like, oh, all those years ago. But he's like, for me, I'm living at that time. It's like, yeah, but still, it's not the same thing as you taking a big risk. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. But we circle back to the whole Adrian situation. There's that line from Adrian, because he's like, oh, he knew that John was on Europa. It's like, how'd you know? He's like, a little elephant told me, which I'm assuming that same little elephant is connected to what was connected to Angela. Like, what the hell that's all about? I have no idea. I would assume that's supposed to be the same elephant, or is that just supposed to be some snide room? I'd assume that's supposed to be something more. Maybe like, well, could we know? Well, because I'm taking this from Only Stupid Answers. They ended up bringing up this interesting point during, it's something I picked up a little bit from one of the reviews, where they were kind of suggesting that Adrian is Lady True's dad. And I was like, that is interesting. It would kind of make sense, the whole like, oh, why she's as smart as she is and everything. And it would also explain the elephant thing. So I'm curious about that. Like, maybe that's something that Adrian had that eventually he passed on to his daughter, or maybe he gave it to Lady True's mom, who eventually gave it. I don't know what to make of that, but like what they said in that moment just kind of made that make sense of like, that might be his kid. But we'll kind of have to wait and see in the long run. But that definitely correlates the two of them together, and like kind of solidifies like there's definitely a connection between Adrian and Lady True, at least just because of that elephant thing sets that up to be something. So we'll see whether that theory of theirs ends up coming true or not. Side note, if you don't know, like DJ and Sam do review Watchmen episode by episode, so probably by the time you're listening to this, like their review is probably up to there. I think theirs go up definitely earlier than mine, I think. But regardless, just in case you're looking for other people, especially people who can really deep dive into it, because like obviously they're more familiar with the source material than I am, and obviously they're very good at the theorizing about like where things could potentially go and stuff like that. So obviously give them a shout out too, and check them out. Obviously, they do a lot of other reviews to movies and TV shows. Once again, here I am pimping out someone else's stuff. But hey, it is what it is type of situation. But regardless, I went on this huge tangent, so I do apologize. But I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing that they kind of set up with that. But I love that Adrian immediately goes like, oh, the only reason why a powerful being like you would come back to Earth, the part of all this would be for love. So let me guess, you fell in love with a woman. The fact of the matter is, oh, she doesn't know what you really are. That's why you look the way you do, which I love that he made a remark about. Like, the fact is, this isn't the 80s anymore. It's 2009. That's called appropriation. Because there is a part of my brain, I won't lie you, there's a part of my brain that's like, yeah, I wonder if anyone wants to say anything about the fact is you are a white dude who disguised yourself as a black guy. I was wondering if it's interesting because I guess, I mean, obviously like he ends up meeting with Will later on in the episode. So I guess it's kind of interesting because like, Will is a black man pretending to be a white man when he was hooded justice. So it's just like, it's not the same thing, but it's just interesting that those two things exist. I'm not trying to necessarily draw a parallel. There kind of is a parallel, but I just thought that was just, kind of a fascinating situation. I'm sure you can extrapolate a lot more from that than I'm really thinking of, because I'm not smart enough to really extrapolate all the meanings behind like what that could necessarily represent, and once again the parallels themselves. But I digress. Moving on. So I just thought it was kind of just an interesting little tag from Adrian to kind of bring that up. I thought that was pretty dope. Like I said, it was just in the back of my mind. But it's like, no, Angela knows what I told her who I am from the beginning. He's like, whoa, really? Huh? He's like, well, the fact of the matter is, it's still the thing of you are a god, and the fact of the matter is you want to be loved. Like, oh, you want her to love you for you, but how can you really do that when you are the way you are? But it's like, okay, so how is that? It's like, well, that's why I'm here for your help. And Adrian suggesting this device, because apparently it's made for some material. It is the one blind spot that Dr. Manhattan has. It's like in the entire, at least to our knowledge, in the entire universe, that's the one thing that kind of affects his powers, affects his sight. And now there's actually, and he actually talks about it later on, there's a blind spot in that time frame. He doesn't know, from meeting with Angela, like to being with her till like the end of their the end of that 10-year period, he has a blank spot. And now we know why, because this particular device is affecting his memories. It's kind of interesting that this came from Adrian. In fact, Adrian was like, oh, this was actually plan A. Plan B was to blow you up, but this was actually plan A at the time, because apparently he came up with this back in 85. So I was like, oh man, dude, just everything kind of coming together like that. So I thought that was pretty dope. I also love that Adrian, it kind of shows you how much of a kind of a self-centered, narcissistic person. He's like, yeah, I saved the world. I mean, to be fair, it shouldn't be too much of a shock, because we've already seen an instance of how self-congratulatory he is, because he literally made a video like, the new Redford, you're the next president. Well, let me tell you, I'm the one behind the squid. You should thank me, world peace and all that. So we already know he kind of like strokes his own ego. So that's not too much of a surprise. But he's so narcissistic. He's like, I want to be thanked. Like, the fact is, I should be worshipped. I literally stopped nuclear war. And it's like, you can't, you're not, that must mean that this has been eating at him for the past 22-ish years at that point in time. It's like, that's crazy to think about. That the fact of the matter, well, 24 at that time, I forgot, because there was an extra 2 years, but it was like all that time was eating away at him about, not being able to, be celebrated. Because for him, I think if people knew that he was the one that kind of concocted all this to stop, well, because obviously people can't know because it's meant to keep up the lie. But because of that, I think because people don't know what he did for the world, no one else is taking his thoughts of like, oh, we should do this and do that. Like, I'm giving you the blueprints of kind of keeping things good and not going down routes of making weapons and stuff like that. But because no one's going to listen to him, because they're just like, oh yeah, you're smart and everything, sure, but who cares? Your opinion doesn't matter. It's like, but if they knew he was the one that saved the world and everything, then I think he feels like I would get a little more congratulations. But it's like, once again, it's kind of a snake eating its own tail thing, because it's like, if he told them, it kind of defeat the purpose. You get what I'm trying to say. It keeps going in a circle. So, but to have so now we understand why he got sent to paradise, that quote unquote prison. I thought it was interesting, because I was like, okay, so, because it made it seem like he got put there, someone held him there, but even he was like, it wasn't always a prison, So I guess the whole point is, the fact is that well, because I think he said for the past 4 years. So I kept being under the impression, it was like, well, we know it's 2009, so you've been there for 10 years. But I think because I kept getting caught up on the 4 years, these past 4 years, he was talking about, of that 10 years, I guess 6 years of it was exciting, but the last 4 years became an issue for him, because he wanted to go there because, obviously, John had said, like, hey, the fact of the matter is, I made this world and these people who want to serve me, who want to, please me. But the fact of the matter is, their love is so infinite. They're so always trying to please you. And it's so interesting to hear him be like, honestly, it was unfulfilling, just because I guess for him, it's like, I think there's a part of him that likes people being able to do whatever they want to, but like Mr. Phillips and Miss Croshank will just do whatever he wants. They'll do everything to please him, and so it kind of makes things a little boring. So he bounced. So he presents his opportunity to Adrian because this is a place where he can be worshipped. All that infinite love they'll give to him, which, hey, he enjoyed it for at least 6 years, it seems. But that last 4, it got on his nerves, because I think for him it's just kind of like, well, this place is peaceful. I don't know why I kept saying that backwards. So the fact of the matter is, like, I guess for him it's like, I'm needed elsewhere. Jeez, I am losing my ability to talk. I apologize. I've never been the greatest speaker anyway, so it's not like I made much of an improvement. Regardless, tangent. Get to the point, Michael. Sorry. So the fact of the matter is, I guess because he looks at the people on Earth, it's like, oh, those 8 billion, they're my children, and they need me and everything, which I'm going to get to all that later on, but it's just interesting. Okay, so there's that. We're cutting back, obviously, to the bar, to present day, what we perceive as present day, what he kind of doesn't perceive, 2019, let's leave it at that, and to kind of specify. But it's so interesting because, like I said, Angela still isn't believing him. It's like, oh yeah, you can be able to create life, or create life. He creates an egg, and she's just kind of thinking probably like, oh, it's a magic BS, like whatever the case may be. I even loved I forgot about that joke where he was like, yeah, she's like, oh, how long did it actually take you to make life? And he was like, yeah, 90 seconds. And she's like, oh. And he's like, what is it? She's like, oh, so like, you mean like any man making life under 2 minutes? And he was like, oh, that was a sex joke. Which I even think that is kind of interesting, because it does seem like he has a bit of a sense of humor. I thought that was kind of fascinating, because even Adrian was like, huh, you're actually smiling and laughing. This Angelo must have a really interesting effect on you in the long run. Once again, I'll talk about the fact that Angelo's one of the few people that was able to bring John back to his humanity. I think that's an accomplishment on his own, especially when everyone... It's so interesting, because I didn't even think about this when I was talking about it last episode. Lori's going to feel a certain way. That had to be weird when she actually thinks about it, when it's like the man that you're with, like Lori, his ex, was talking to her, sending him a message like that. I mean, I don't know. Like being his wife and everything must kind of make you feel a certain way. She had to have known who Lori... Well, because she didn't know at the beginning who Lori was, but the moment she heard who Lori was, that must have hit something and be like, oh... I mean, I'm curious how much, you know enough about Dr. Manhattan, just because, like, I'm sure there's, for one, just in, Vietnam, but just in general, like, the Watchmen were big time heroes. So I'm sure, like, him and Silk Spectre 2, or, Lori being a thing, like, I'm sure she already knew that ahead of time, but I was like, not unless John ended up bringing up that stuff. But it didn't seem like stuff that John would talk about, but maybe he did. I don't know. So the moment she found out Lori was Lori, and it's probably like in that moment she's like, wait, you're John's ex? Which that means that must have been rattling off in her brain the entire time. Maybe. That's just crazy to think about. But to think that, how is Lori going to feel the moment she finds out that Cal... Because there was even moments where she talked about the fact is that she found Cal interesting, because they had talked, but it was all off screen. I don't think they've had any on-screen moments together, and maybe that was on purpose because of this big reveal and everything. Like I said, these are things I should have brought up last episode. I just didn't even think about until like after I'd already done a recording, like well after I'd already done a recording, like the next day or two. I was sitting there thinking about like, damn, that's something interesting to think about, because like Lori doesn't know about that yet. So it's like, oh, regardless, I just thought that was all fascinating. Sorry for going on that other tangent, but still. But present day, she's trying to get John to like remember, because obviously his mind's a little jilted, because like literally these past 10 years have been a blank. So it's like, okay, I got to figure out what time frame I'm in. He's actually kind of confused about what year it is, because he's trapped between like obviously when they were at the bar together, even at one point having that conversation with Adrian, and now present day 2019. So he's kind of popping all over the place, and she's like, motherfucker, like sit still. He goes outside on top of the pool, and then she's like, what? Goes up to the kids, and they're like, holy crap, there's a blue man out there. Why does that blue man look like Cal? Because that is Cal. And it's like, and he waves them away, and she's like, what the hell did you do? He was like, I sent them to your dad or your grandfather. And it's like, why would you do that? And it turns out, because even Lady Truth said this last episode, that actually it was actually Cal that, or Dr. Manhattan, that put the idea in his head, and he put that idea in Lady True's head about like the 7th Cavalry's plan and stuff like that. Which I guess that's how because he must. I wonder, John didn't say his name at the time, but it must have been a thing of when he was doing his research on Angela and sees that she's married to Cal. I was like, right, that's that dude I met 10 years ago. So that's probably like that's how they knew about Cal's identity ahead of time. Not unless that was some of the conversation with Will that we never got, but regardless, like I said, tangents and all that. And I even love this situation, that whole reveal with like, okay, like he's talking to Will at the same time. He's talking to Will 10 years ago at the same time he's talking to Angela here in 2019. And I love her being like, all right, if you can talk to him, ask him how did he know about Crawford. And he asked Will, and Will was like, who's Crawford? And it's like, and then Angela, she's like, shit. She's like, I messed everything up, didn't I? Because that means, did I start all this? Because I put my grandfather in a position of killing Judd, which is like, yeah, because Judd's death is kind of what started a lot. I mean, granted, the 7th Cavalry stuff was already in the background, but to be fair, it was a situation of his death kind of escalated everything because it sent Angela down the path that she went down and stuff like that. So it's like she kind of jump-started a lot of this. Granted, a lot of this other stuff was already in the background. It makes me wonder, how did the 7th Cavalry find out who Cal really was? Like, they must have known the entire time, or was that a more recent discovery? Part of me wonders, you don't think that Wade had anything to do with that? Well, Wade's able to tell when people are lying or something like that. I don't know, man. I mean, it's not like he'd be able to tell with the whole Cal situation, because Cal would believe his lies because he wouldn't know. Like, not unless there was some subconscious thing where he was kind of like showing that he was lying without realizing he was lying. Yeah, I doubt that, but it was like, Wade's the first thing that came to my mind, but I'm like, I doubt that. But it's like, how else did he find out about it? Maybe we'll kind of find out about it in the future, but regardless. As Cal was saying with the whole Will and Angela thing of like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? In this particular situation, literally both happened simultaneously. It's like, that's just, God, time stuff is always crazy and wacky, but especially when we're kind of getting time all working at different points in time while also happening at the same time. It's crazy. It's a lot to take in. So that all went down. He went inside to make, waffles. She grabs the eggs that he was levitating and smashed them on the ground of like, you know what's coming. But for him, it's like, yes. The fact of the matter is, there's no changing it. They're going to take me because they have a weapon that's going to destroy me. Because he had brought it up all those years ago that basically if he puts his powers into something organic and you eat it, you basically gain all its powers and stuff like that. I was like, that's interesting. Theoretically, that's how it's going to work. So, but Angela refusing to let him go is like, no, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna save you. And she goes out there, guns a-blazing, kicking ass. Got the silencer at first, pew, pew. Then gets some heavy artillery, driving in the car. Things look bad until John pops up, start evaporating heads off of people. I'm like, whoa. And it's like, oh, we saved the day. But then John was like, because she's like, see, I saved you. And he was like, see, sadly, no. Because that was the whole thing in itself, too. Because it's like, I love that line of like, why would I get in a relationship if I know it's going to end tragically? Which, John was like, well, doesn't every relationship end tragically? Which is like, yeah. Because every relationship ends either because you broke up or because the other person died. Which is like, it's actually super sad when you actually think about that on an existential level, that every relationship ends in sadness, in tragedy, because you lose the person that you're in a relationship with in some shape or form. And I'm like, damn, that's actually super deep. I know maybe I'm super, maybe what I think is deep is kind of like, maybe I'm a very surface person, so like something like that isn't that deep seems deep to me, but I thought that was some like super deep stuff to kind of think of. I'm like, man, this show is actually really smart. And just the way it kind of presents itself and does stuff like that sits with me. So I'm like, man, I can vibe with that. Like, every relationship ends in tragedy. That's just, man, I don't know. Regardless, it is a whole thing of like, oh, why don't you tell me how it's all going to end? What's going to happen? What's the tragedy in our relationship? He's like, I won't tell you because I think in the end, it's like, it won't matter. Because also for him, it almost seems like he tries to influence things while also not trying to influence him. Because it seems like there's things, because even when he was talking to Will, I think he was saying like there are things that are beyond his influence because he didn't know what happened in that 10-year period. And, obviously we still don't know, but obviously him and Angela had a happy life and everything. He had even let her know ahead of time of like, oh yeah, I got these 3 kids and stuff like that. We have these 3 kids and everything. We adopted them. It's like, where did it came from? Didn't warn her about White Knight because obviously he wouldn't know about White Knight because he was under. It falls into spots of that blank ear. So it's not like he's being an asshole not telling her. I mean, there's a lot he wasn't telling her, but that's because there was actually quite a bit he didn't know, even as powerful as he was. But he had brought it up to Will about the whole thing to Angela, despite, because the fact of the matter is she wanted a family to kind of, even no matter how much she denies it, she wants to have a family to kind of make up for the family she never had, just because, her grandma died on her the day they met. Her parents died, so she was kind of left alone, trying to fill that hole in her heart. And I think secretly, John presented himself to her as being mysterious and stuff like that, so it intrigued her. But getting back to present day, it's like, it's like, see, John, I told you, but the weapon activates and kills him, absorbs him. It seemed more so like killing him, but it's like, is he permanently dead, or like what? Because he had said that it was going to trap him, or at least force him to teleport or something, right? But then it was like it was going to kill him. So I guess like they're going to break him down into something that could be digestible, because it's supposed to be not only for Kane, for other people too, turning them also into Dr. Manhattan's. Once again, he has said he theorized that's how that whole situation would work, but maybe it won't. Maybe it will momentarily, but maybe it's just too much power for a human to naturally own. Like, you probably have to go through the certain process that he went through to get his powers. Otherwise, it ends up ripping you apart and potentially killing you. Whereas, like, he got ripped apart and became Dr. Manhattan. Maybe you get all full of power. Like, we might be going like DBZ Android levels of you give them too much energy, Android 19, they explode type of situation. That might be kind of where we're going with that. We'll kind of see. So it is, the sad situation of almost this self-fulfilling prophecy of just kind of like him asking her to go out for dinner the next night, her saying yes at the same moment she's losing him, just the parallels of like the beginning yet and the end all happening at once. I just thought that was kind of neat how that was presented. But also circling back, it's also like this whole Adrian thing that I kind of brought up earlier, which, side note, let me know, has there been something at the end of every one of these episodes? I hope not, because there probably has been. Because I know Cinemax does that. I know certain networks do that whole thing of like, there's a little bit at the tail end. Honestly, I've skipped the credits every time. Like, I've never sat through them completely, because even when I'm DVRing them, I'm just like skipping through it so I can just like get to the end of the recording so I can delete it. So I've never watched it, because all I usually see is like clips for the next episode. So is this the first episode to have something at the end, or was there others? If there were others, please let me know so I can go back and rewatch them and see what I missed potentially. Hopefully I'm lucky and this episode was the only one, especially considering, next week's episode is the season finale, but we'll get to that in a second. But the whole Adrian thing I thought was kind of fascinating. It's like, this whole book about like, I'm reading this book about loneliness. You wouldn't know anything about it. And then the game master is like, I would know about loneliness. I was here at the beginning. It was like, that's why you're kind of like, it seems like you're very different from the other Mr. Phillips and Mrs. Croshank. Which begs the question, what happened to your Mrs. Croshank? She must have died because of Adrian's experiments or something like that. And because it makes you wonder how he ended up becoming the game warden. Maybe that was something that was set up either after John left or maybe before. Well, no, because it had to be after, but the thing is, we don't see his Miss Croshank. We only see him. So, but he's like, I've literally been here since the beginning, like, which is kind of crazy to think about, because in the grand scheme of things, that means he's been there for, 30-ish years? Yeah, because, like, John made him, like, after the events of Watchmen, so it's like, I'm like, wow. So you're OG, Mr. You were essentially, you're Adam. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So for him, it's like, I know about loneliness, and the fact of the matter is, because they're trying to stop Adrian from leaving, because it's that whole thing of like, you're supposed to stay here, because if they don't have him, they don't have anyone to worship at all, because John left them, and they have deep abandonment issues, because literally the only being you have ever known outside of yourselves, who basically made you, who gave you purpose, left you. So now that someone else is there, someone else is your new master, you're not so willing to give them up. So thought that was kind of interesting. But at the same time, I guess his Miss Phillip and Miss Croshank, I guess the most recent ones, left him a horseshoe inside of the cake, and he's trying to make his escape. So that's the whole thing. And all of this is happening, and I'm just like, wow. Dude, I'm sure there's so much about this episode I was thinking about earlier, but I forgot to bring up during this recording. How I know? Because it happens every time. But dude, this was such a great episode. And obviously, like I was bringing up earlier, next week's episode is in fact the season finale. It's going to be wild to see how all of this comes together, how this all ends. Because how is Adrian going to get to Earth? You're literally on Jupiter. Just once again, you're on Jupiter's moon, or at least one of their moons. So how the hell, even if you get past, which I'm wondering, that's so interesting. I guess John made it like that. I wonder why. I guess maybe because he didn't want anyone to know that paradise existed. He was keeping it hidden. I'm just because remember, there's like it's almost an illusion that keeps it cloaked. Because we saw Adrian bust through that and land on top of the moon, but now it's like he got sucked back into the illusion that is his paradise. So I wonder why John made it like that. But like I said, maybe it's just to keep a blind eye, so everyone's still under the impression like, oh, there's stuff going down on Mars, whatever the hell he's doing, not paying attention what he's actually doing on Jupiter. But nevertheless, that's quite fascinating. All of that to see where ultimately all this ends up taking us going forward into the season finale, as literally all storylines have officially kind of crossed at this point in time. I think there might be, I don't know, I think everything's heading in the same direction now. We kind of, all the reveals are kind of out there now, at least, that we're aware of. So I'm curious to see, well, what else might get revealed in the season finale and how this whole shebang is going to end up ending. So that's going to be quite interesting. But till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.